Welcome to the Peter King Podcast, presented by Salesforce. So happy you can join us in a week with, there's just too much news to discuss. So we're not going to have a 50-minute podcast. It's going to actually be 5 hours. So just settle in, because, what else do you have today or this week rather than all of the immense news around the National Football League? Myles, welcome. I hope you've got a lot of voice because we got a lot to discuss.
Yeah, we certainly do. And, I had to do an extra half hour yesterday after the news of Frank Reich's firing came down. And then came the even more surprising news that Jeff Saturday is going to now be the interim head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. And there's a lot going on in Indianapolis. I mean, we could probably do 3 hours just on what's going on there.
All right, so let me run down the pod. All right, first of all, we are going to have Stephen Holder, the excellent beat man who covers the Indianapolis Colts for ESPN.com. He will be this week's guest. For all of you who were tuning in, because in my column this week in Football Morning in America, I said we'd have Michael Zagaris, the superb sports photographer who's got a book out with some incredible pictures in it. We'll delay that. We'll have that up here in 2 or 3 weeks. But we're going to have Stephen Holder on mid-pod to discuss all things Colts. In the back half of our podcast, we are going to discuss the Ravens, who are 6-3. They've won 3 in a row. An incredibly impressive performance on Monday Night Football. And they have, in the next 3 weeks, a bye, Carolina and Jacksonville. So if you love the Cincinnati Bengals, you just got to be careful. There's no assuming you're going to win the NFC North. And I'll tell you this. It was tough going to the Super Bowl last year, playing all on the road. Well, Bengals might have to do it again this year. But again, we'll see. Plenty of clock left in this NFL season. We'll also discuss the Bills being in a little trouble, and also Josh Allen's elbow concerns. Mike McCarthy returns to the scene of his prime. Dallas goes to Green Bay this weekend. We'll talk about that. The Jets, 6-3 with a defense that can play with anyone. We'll also talk about the Minnesota Vikings. It's amazing. The Minnesota Vikings, 7-1. Not a lot of people are talking about them. Seems like every game is a struggle. But you know what? In the NFL, as one wise old owl once said, a win is a win. We'll also talk about the Philadelphia Eagles sitting there on top from their perch atop the NFL at 8-0. And we'll talk about Tom Brady, who's on pace to throw for 200,000 yards by age 65. And we'll talk about what so far has been the incredible year, this year so far of Tyreek Hill. And I wrote in my column on Monday that Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are the first receiver combination ever in the NFL to be on pace to combine for a 200-yard per game average in a season for 2 receivers. So a lot to get to, but I will start with the Indianapolis Colts in their very, very strange decision on Monday to fire, not just to fire Frank Reich, which really wasn't all that strange. The performance on Sunday in New England was god-awful. And it wasn't just Sam Ehlinger. It was that offensive line, which is just terrible, surprisingly. After spending all that money and all that draft capital on the offensive line, they are plumbing the depths right now. And it wasn't just firing Reich, which I think was not that much of a shock. The owner of the Colts, Jim Irsay, is an impetuous guy at times. I'm not even sure this is that impetuous, quite honestly, because you just can't be as hopeless as the Colts looked on Sunday. But I think the hiring of Jeff Saturday, I'm just going to say a couple of things about it. You're right. Everybody is correct when they say that the Jeff Saturday ascension to be the interim coach with, you can hear it in Jim Irsay's voice after that bizarre press conference on Monday night in Indianapolis. You can hear it in Jim Irsay's voice. He wants Jeff Saturday to be the full-time coach of his team. You can just hear it.
Yes.
And I think unless this is a debacle, he's got a heck of a chance to be the full-time coach of this team. And for all those who would say, hey, in the 61 years since, or in the last 60 years, there has never been a coach who hasn't played in college football or pro football. And I am going to be on board to be very critical of this decision. But I just want to say 3 things about Jeff Saturday. Number one, there's an old NFL Films clip of Jeff Saturday on the sidelines arguing vociferously with Peyton Manning.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it was very impressive to me. Could you imagine, the center of the Green Bay Packers or of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers or in his day of the New Orleans Saints arguing like that with Drew Brees or Tom Brady or or Aaron Rodgers? I really can't. That's number one. So I think he, relatively speaking, is unafraid. Number two, I'm going to go back in time 11 years. Okay, I was covering, and I did not cover it every day. Albert Breer did an incredible job of covering the labor dispute every day in 2011, in the middle of the summer. But anyway, I just remember right near the end, in a hotel in Washington, D.C., where they were it was like 11:55 on the clock of these negotiations. I saw deep in a corner Roger Goodell and Jeff Saturday having a beer. No D. Smith, no anybody, no other negotiators from the NFL. Roger Goodell and Jeff Saturday having a beer, and that interested me, that it came down to 2 people basically at the end discussing where these negotiations were. A day or 2 later, they had a deal. But so I just will say that I think Jeff Saturday is going to understand that everyone is going to be looking at him like, what a joke this is. What an absolute total joke. That they bring in a guy who's never coached in the NFL, who has never coached in college football, ever. And you're going to have immense skepticism. He knows it. He knows exactly what everybody is thinking. This is the dumbest decision in the history of decisions. He also knows that everybody is looking at this coaching staff, which has 2 former head coaches on it, veteran coaches, Gus Bradley, John Fox. And why in the world is he getting the job over one of these veteran guys who could steer the ship in the last 2 months of this disastrous season? So there's all that. And Myles, I'm going to just ask you, even with everything I just said, I believe this was an impetuous, wrong decision, because it's going to be difficult, I believe, for Jeff Saturday to stand in front of a room of 53 players who, I'm told, really revered Frank Reich and absolutely had not given up on him, even though they were playing poorly. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to harness the energy of that room and to make those guys play hard, and also to make that coaching staff believe in him.
That's the most interesting thing to me, is the coaching staff element of all of this, because I don't know exactly what is going to go on offensively, right? Who is putting together the offensive game plan? We don't even know. I mean, as we sit here recording this at 9:15-ish Eastern here on Tuesday morning, we don't know who their offensive coordinator is because they fired Frank Reich on Monday, yes, but last week they fired Marcus Brady, who was the former offensive coordinator. And no, he wasn't calling plays, but that man had a lot to do with the game plan and implementing the game plan. And to me, no, I read this. I read a lot of stuff out of Indianapolis over the last, I don't know, 24 hours. And one writer said this, and I wish I could remember exactly who it was. But this move just speaks to being an unserious move by an unserious franchise. Whenever you have a situation where somebody is going to come into the building who has never coached at the college or NFL level, whose only coaching experience has been in high school, who's never implemented a game plan before. That to me is the most concerning aspect of all of this. I mean, how are they supposed to get the most out of Sam Ehlinger when you don't have an offensive philosophy? You don't know who's going to call the plays. You don't know what kind of plays you even want to run. I mean, it's bizarre. And I'll tell you, Peter, I loved watching the press conference last night from Jim Irsay and Chris Ballard and Jeff Saturday, in part because it was the most fun I've ever had watching a press conference because it was that bizarre. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm like recording clips of it and sending them to my friends and being like, hey, yeah, this is like when your buddy tells you, don't go talk to that girl at the bar anymore. And Jim Irsay saying like, man, I don't, Michael Jordan took how many shots and, he lost this many games. And it's like, what are you talking about? Michael Jordan didn't play football, and you're talking about this game, but it's that game, and it's this, and it's that, and my head was exploding. But this move right here is something that is going to be criticized for years and years and years to come, I think, because it, like I said, it's an unserious move by an unserious franchise at the end of the day.
Here's the thing. If they don't win 3 to 5 games down the stretch of this season, which is a tough ask considering. Yeah. Let me run down their schedule, by the way. I'll run down their schedule the rest of the way, which includes a Pittsburgh Indianapolis Monday night game. That ought to be a joy. And I can't wait to hear. I can't wait to hear the ESPN talking heads before that game, as to what they're going to say. They have been, I would say, measured in their analysis. I would call it,
of course,
measured, because obviously it's a colleague. But here's their schedule. At Las Vegas, home to the Philadelphia Eagles, home to Pittsburgh, at Dallas, a bye to try to make sense of it all, at Minnesota, Chargers at home, at the Giants, and then Houston at home. And look, just look at that schedule. First of all, Philadelphia, Dallas, Minnesota, they're going to be anywhere between, I would say, 8 and 14-point underdogs in all of those games. Probably. But there's that part of it. And the other part I would say is, look, Myles, I admire Jeff Saturday for saying at this press conference, when he was asked what he thought when Jim Irsay called him, he said, and I quote, "Shocked would be an understatement. I'll be frank. I asked Mr. Irsay, tell me why I'm a candidate you would consider in any role to do this," end quote. So, Jeff Saturday is not thinking, oh, well, I've been waiting for somebody to call me to take me off the high school sidelines where I have been a coach. So Jeff Saturday understands that the world believes that this is the dumbest decision in the history of decisions, as I said. And he knows that he's going to have to prove to a lot of people that he has some business being there.
I mean, Peter, man, I don't know. It's just so freaking bizarre. And I don't think it's Jeff Saturday's fault. I respect him for trying to make the best out of the situation. Of course, you're going to make the best out of the situation. But like I said, I mean, he is about as overmatched as you could possibly be from the standpoint of who is implementing the game plan, right? That's what the head coach does. It's not just because this is one of the things that like stood out to me about this press conference. Yeah, it seemed like Jim Irsay was basically saying, yeah, the head coach's job is to be a motivator. And it's like, that's not really it. There's a lot that goes into game planning, right? It's not just, oh, yeah, I'm going to sit down at my PlayStation and turn on the game and then run the same 3 plays the entire time. And then maybe I'll beat the either the computer or some person online that I beat, because that's just the way that's not what happens here. Game plans get implemented starting early on in the week. The coaches have to figure out what they think is the best way to beat another team. And then they then install that over the course of Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. They make adjustments. You have different periods of red zone. How do you schedule things out? I mean, that's one thing that Jeff Saturday's never done. How do you schedule the day? How do you make sure the travel is right in coordination with the operations director or coordinator, whatever they happen to call it within that franchise? I mean, there are just so many different little elements that I feel like Jim Irsay is kind of overlooking here when you say, oh, yes, that's what this interim head coach is going to be. And the other part about this is that there was just some big level of defiance from both Jim Irsay and also Chris Ballard, which what Chris Ballard was saying about, oh, you guys have been kicking the mess out of me about not drafting a wide receiver, and now our offensive line stinks too. And it's like, well, yeah, there are no real good playmakers at receiver aside from Michael Pittman. And now, the way you've constructed the team is very much failing. And, Jim Irsay is saying, yeah, I imagine that Ballard's going to be around for 2023. There's no question in my mind or whatever. But I mean, it's not like last week he wasn't saying that Frank Reich was also safe. So there are just so many elements to this that it's just like, what in the world is going on? And I don't know, Peter. I mean, you've obviously been doing this a lot longer than I have, but I've never seen anything like this. And there's a reason why it's unprecedented, right? Sometimes things are outside the box because that's where they're supposed to be. And that just keeps replaying through my mind anytime I keep seeing or hearing anything about the Colts over the last 24 hours.
3 other quick points, and then we'll take a break. Number one, the guy who Jeff Saturday needs to appoint his play caller and offensive coordinator is former CFL head coach named Scott Milanovic. He coached Toronto and Montreal in the CFL. He's been a quarterback's coach at both the Jaguars and the Indianapolis Colts, where he is currently. He works day to day with Sam Ehlinger, has worked with Matt Ryan. So he's really about the only guy, I think, who Jeff Saturday can turn to. That's number one. Number two, I'm really curious. Look, there is a fire alarm going on. There is a desperate feel to what Jim Irsay did. And I'm just really surprised that one of the things that Jeff Saturday said was, okay, first thing we're going to do is Matt Ryan is back at starting quarterback. I don't know how you think that Sam Ehlinger's got a better chance to beat Las Vegas on Sunday than Matt Ryan does. I don't know how that's possible.
Well, they are the Raiders, and they've blown 3 leads of 17 points or more. So, I mean, I'm not counting the Colts out this week.
I'm not counting them out at all. But who gives you a better chance to win on Sunday?
No, you're right.
Sam Ehlinger or Matt Ryan, who's thrown for 9 jillion yards in the NFL. And I know that Matt Ryan's first 6 or 7 weeks were a debacle. I get it. But, and the last thing, and this is a weird thing to think about. The last thing I think is this really, for anybody like me, who really gave Jim Irsay a lot of credit for ripping into Daniel Snyder and for questioning Daniel Snyder's ownership and basically saying, we need to look at whether Daniel Snyder continues to be an owner in this league. And he's the only person to call him out. This sort of kind of reduces his credibility. It just does, because everybody is thinking, who's this, who's the crazy uncle sitting over in the corner who appointed a franchise hero who's never coached at any level above high school, the head coach of an NFL team that's in crisis. So I don't know. Those are three thoughts. Myles, I don't really know what else to say, but we're going to listen to Stephen Holder, who I've got great respect for over the years covering the NFL. And he's been in the middle of this mess in Indianapolis. He was there Monday night, wrote a very cogent, good wrap up of where this franchise is. So let's go and listen to Stephen Holder talk about the debacle of Jeff Saturday being named the interim coach of the Indianapolis Colts. So, Stephen Holder, we're recording this on Tuesday morning after one of the strangest days, maybe the strangest day, since a Mayflower moving van took the Colts from Baltimore to Indianapolis in 1984. That's a long time ago. That's 38 years ago. But this was an incredible day. I want to first of all ask you, you wake up in Indianapolis this morning. What is the Colts fan thinking this morning?
There's kind of a split. And if social media is any indication, or, and I think it is, there's kind of a split. And that split is this. There are some folks who I think are taken by Jeff Saturday's legacy and his fame locally. Certainly, he still has commercials running in the Indianapolis area. He's been a fixture here. He was never a fixture. It hasn't been. So there are some people who are taking to that and gravitating to this and saying, well, we love Jeff Saturday. Let's go. And I understand that, right? They are, however, certainly that segment is removing a big part of the equation from this, which is the fact that he's never done this. And so there's that other segment of fans who are saying, okay, look, I love the Colts. I love Jeff Saturday, but what? So I don't think there's really any middle ground. I don't think there are a lot of people saying, yeah, I'm not sure, but let's see. I think they're either all the way in or they're all the way on the other side of the spectrum saying, what are we doing? So we'll see. Somebody will be right. Somebody will be wrong.
Stephen, you were on hand on Monday night for the press conference introducing Jeff Saturday. Many observations. I think people who did not know the meaning of the word quartile now know the meaning of that word. But I wonder, how did you, as somebody who's sitting in the middle of that, how would you describe the scene of that weird press conference?
Surreal, for one. And then I think the other takeaway for me was, certainly we had known the news by the time that press conference happened. We had known the news for over 8 hours, right? So it had registered for the most part.
Sunk in. Yeah.
Right. The question remained, though. And the question was, okay, why? And that was, I thought, something Jim Irsay struggled to articulate. I wanted to hear that. And he struggled to articulate it beyond saying, well, Jeff is really tough and he was a great player and we love Jeff. Yes, we know that. Everyone knows that. Everyone agrees with that. He's great on TV. He was a great football player. He certainly, I imagine, has contributed to the team in a demonstrable way by being a consultant for the team, right? So this is, none of that's in question. I think the question is why Jeff Saturday for this job. So as it was going on and on, I was hoping for that, and I think we had to get a little more forceful with trying to nail him down on that particular point. But to your original question, just taking it all in, it was really surreal. I mean, here is Jim Irsay, Jeff Saturday, and Chris Ballard sitting up there on this stage, after the firing of Frank Reich just 10 or 12 hours earlier. And here's a new coach who no one saw coming. I mean, it's just, look, we have had some stuff here, okay? And because you've covered it all. We've had Josh McDaniels bailing on the Colts 12 hours before his introductory press conference, okay? Now, it doesn't get more bizarre than that, but it did. So we thought it wouldn't. It did. Andrew Luck retired after a preseason game in August, right, in 2019. And now this. This one was, I don't know if we ranked them. I don't know where they rank, but this is pretty close to the top of anything I've ever seen in my 25 years.
Really think about this. The Andrew Luck decision was really a shot out of the blue. Stunning. And, I guess Andrew Luck retiring out of the blue is a little bit more stunning than Jeff Saturday being named the interim coach. But the fact that they're even in the same ballpark is amazing.
Yes.
Because when a franchise quarterback who you think is going to be your quarterback for the next 10 years, just after an exhibition game says, oh, by the way, I'm retiring. And then the other part of the weird thing is then he legitimately disappears, and he has just assumed this private persona out in the world that, anyway, that's weird. But yeah. I don't know. There's just something about this that it's almost like you expect this to come out of the Jets. Or something. This is very Jetsy. It's like if the Jets said, oh, we're hiring Joe Namath to succeed Robert Saleh. But there's one other thing that interested me. And Stephen, this would probably be 49th on most people's list. But I know Chris Ballard well. And I thought he was really a little bit overly defensive in that press conference for a team that is in absolute total free fall. It was just a little bit about him, which I thought was odd. Take me into Ballard, what you know about him, and why do you think he reacted in such a kind of a self-defensive way?
That was Ballard, the South Texan. That's what you saw yesterday, right? Now, it does come out quite frequently, but I think I agree with you here that this was an odd time to really lean into that. And it was my question really that I'm not taking credit for this, but I'm just recapping it. It was my question that kind of led to this because my question was, I thought, pretty obvious. Like, Chris, Frank Reich might be gone, but you put this roster together. And I mean, this is year 6 of Chris Ballard's tenure. And as I said to him, I said, this team is as far away as I've ever seen it. How do you explain this? And I thought he kind of oversimplified it by making it about the offensive line. Granted, the offensive line is awful, epically bad. That is true. But I think it's bigger than that, right? I mean, the state of this team is very worrisome to the fan base right now because there were a lot of expectations. And it's not just that they're not winning, it's that they have fallen so far beyond or below, I should say, their expectations. That's the thing here. It's one thing to fall short. They look inept. There's no other way to put it. And that people are having a hard time stomaching that. So I think that is the context that you're talking about as to why he went there. I do think that he definitely has felt a lot of frustration. I had a brief conversation with him recently just about the state of things, and he has been just absolutely stunned by the state of the offensive line. I mean, I am too. Everybody is. I didn't think they had a great offensive line just because they had a couple of big holes, but I thought they were good enough elsewhere that it would be fine. They were wrong. I mean, they could not have been more wrong. They really have been stunned to see Quentin Nelson getting put on his rear end. That I've just never seen that at this rate. Braden Smith, who's a very good right tackle, just hadn't been there this year. Ryan Kelly at center, who's made the Pro Bowl in the past, he looks terrible. I don't enjoy saying this. It's awful. So I think to give some context to Chris Ballard's statements, I think here's a guy who he felt like, okay, I went out and I got these young skill position players. They feel like there's a pretty good group there. That is an overachieving group in their estimation. And then the one thing they didn't think they'd have to worry about is what has done them in. So I think it's almost a frustration. Like, man, I thought I had this right and it fell apart. But that's not the fans' fault. That's not the media's fault. And I thought the optics of that were a little bit not the best, because I think it came off as though he was sort of defensive toward criticism from those sources.
What's your opinion of how Jeff Saturday did in the press conference? And what's your opinion of how he will do when he first stands in front of his team on Wednesday?
I thought Jeff came off fine. Jeff is smart. He understands what the criticisms are. They're not criticisms of Jeff Saturday, the person. They're criticisms, or they're not even criticisms. They're questions about Jeff Saturday, the coach, because
Right.
Of course. So I think he did a good job, I think, of separating those things. He's pretty smart and savvy.
Yeah.
And I thought he did a good job of being humble about this. And his quote was something like, look, I have no idea, if this is going to work. He kind of related it to his playing career, which was a guy who arrived in the NFL with no expectations, barely made it to the NFL, and goes on and makes 6 Pro Bowls. So that was, I think, a good reference point. He said, look, I've kind of done this before in another realm as a player, with no expectations. So that's a good, I think, way of couching it and expressing some confidence without also saying, I got this. This will be no problem, right? So that was good. And as far as him with the team, I think he'll be relatable with the team. He's also smart enough, as I just said, to understand what their questions are going to be, the players. Because as he was asked yesterday, what would Jeff Saturday, the TV analyst, say about this? And he gave a great answer. He said, oh, I'd probably think it was pretty crazy. So he has to know his players are probably thinking, wait, what? As much as they may be familiar with Jeff Saturday, because he's been around the team and continues to be, they have no idea what's happening. They don't understand this. They don't understand the basis for this decision, because how could they? So he's going to have to go into it understanding that, but I think he's gracious enough and smart enough that he will approach it the right way. And then the rest of it is going to have to be up to him. He's going to have to put in the work and show that he gets it, he understands it. He's going to have to put in a lot of face time with his leaders and get his message across. And that has been, I think, that's one of the goals. I'm rambling a little bit, but that was one of the successes of Frank Reich, was he really allowed his leaders to lead that locker room and let them sort of spread his message. That, I think, is a good method here for Jeff Saturday to also employ.
At the basis of all this is that obviously since Andrew Luck retired, they just simply haven't gotten the quarterback right long term. I'm stunned at how Matt Ryan played, but I'm also surprised that Jeff Saturday's first act wasn't Matt Ryan's going to get another shot. That really surprised me. It's not that I think Sam Ehlinger's worthless. I think he was decent against Washington. And that was a game that probably the Colts should have won. But the thing that worries me about Ehlinger, and he's facing another good pass rushing team this week, just like they saw in New England on Sunday. He's going to feel some heat in Vegas. And I just don't know if he's good enough to overcome that. I mean, why do you think they didn't give the job back to Ryan to at least just steady the ship for a while?
Yeah, well, first I'll just piggyback on what you just said about pass rush with the young quarterback. I think what does pass rush do? It speeds you up, right? And with a young quarterback, when you speed up a young quarterback, it is happening so fast for them. Look, Matt Ryan is about as mobile as this coffee mug on my desk here, right? But he can see it, he understands it, he knows where to go with the ball, pre-snap, all those things. That they help. They really, really matter. And I get it. Look, he played awful, indefensible. But I do think in adverse circumstances, there are some things that a veteran quarterback can tap into that a young quarterback like Sam Ehlinger is just not equipped to do. So as for why Sam Ehlinger, why are they continuing down this road? I would say the question was, who's going to start on Sunday? And that answer was Sam Ehlinger. Now, Matt Ryan hasn't practiced since he had that shoulder separation. We'll see what happens this week. I got to think he's close, at least to getting back on the field. And then what happens. But we'll see if that remains true over the course of the season. I would say this, though, the fact that they are at least appearing to commit to, for the time being, Sam Ehlinger, it reinforces for me that Jim Irsay was very much in favor of making this quarterback change. I have no indication that Frank Reich wanted to make that move. I have that both from sources and just looking at the situation with my own two eyes. I think Frank Reich went to great pains to say this was a collective decision, which I think is code for, yeah, I just work here. So that's what I think this says. And I think there's enough evidence there to draw these conclusions. The other thing I would say that reinforces that is when Frank Reich, or when the team announced the firing of Marcus Brady, their offensive coordinator, last week, Frank Reich, as he should, took a very different approach to that. And he said, this was on me. This was my decision. He did not say anything about it being a collective decision, team decision, none of those things. So take that for what it's worth, right? So anyhow, with Ehlinger, I do think that Jim Irsay has been smitten with the possibilities of Sam Ehlinger. Is that because Sam Ehlinger is a quarterback he really believes in, or is it because Sam Ehlinger is just the other quarterback? I think it's a little bit of the latter. Jim Irsay is the Colts' #1 fan. He's the owner, he's invested, but he's also at his core, he's a fan, and he just has a lot of fandom in him. It's not a bad thing. I just think you have to separate that sometimes from your acts as an owner. So we'll see how this, plays out at quarterback.
We'll close with this, Stephen Holder. This surprised me a little bit about the quickness of this decision. And I understand Jim Irsay, after watching an offensive head coach, lead his team to 10, 16, and 3 points in the last 3 games. I understand him being fed up, but I also am curious. Jim Irsay is certainly not the wealthiest owner in the National Football League. And he, obviously, there's gradations of wealth, and he's a very rich man. But compared to the Waltons, who own Denver, or compared to David Tepper, who owns Carolina, Jim Irsay is not in their league. His wealth basically is from his team. And I'm curious. I don't know how much money you would think that Reich, when he got his contract extension, I'll just guess that maybe he's getting extended for about $8 million a year. Okay. He was extended through 2026. So conservatively, Jim Irsay probably owes Frank Reich $30 million. And yet he fired him in the middle of a season with 4.5 years left. I think I'm right in saying this. 23, 24, 25, 26, plus the rest of this year. I'm just guessing it's got to be somewhere in that neighborhood of like 30 million, whatever it is. Does that part of it surprise you in the least?
A little bit. You're not wrong. And I think this is something that football fans may or may not really grasp, but you are absolutely correct. This is, number one, a small market team. They can't tap into the same sorts of, non-ticket revenue that Jerry Jones can, for example,
Right.
or the New York teams. And there is certainly socialism in the NFL, right? Revenue sharing and all that. That is certainly true. But there are other avenues that some teams can tap that others cannot. You just can't, right? And the Colts are in the cannot category. This is, we're in the Midwest. There's a couple million people in the region. This is not not the New York, New Jersey area. So you're absolutely right. That also, by the way, and Colts fans, I hope, grasp this too. That also impacts how they operate in the offseason too. Okay. Cash layout is a thing, right? I mean, when you're talking about these huge mega contracts you see being given to free agents, there's a cash component there. And there's a budget. Okay. They're a business. There's a budget. There's no question about it. So yes. Am I surprised or stunned, I guess, that Jim Irsay did this given the financial consequences? No, but I do think they had to at least consider it and consider the impact of that, because it's very real. There's no doubt about it. It's very real. And he just did this last year. Okay. Just did it very recently.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I mean, you're going to have to either Jeff Saturday is going to be your long-term coach, and you're going to have to pay him a decent salary, or they go to someone else. And especially if they go this route, if they go out and conduct a real coaching search and go find someone who's in demand, that's going to be expensive. So it's a huge cash layout. And I figured it had gotten to a point of no return just because the offensive returns were so indefensible. But that was the one thing that I wondered about. And it's also one of the reasons I wasn't certain that both Frank Reich and Chris Ballard would go, because now you're doubling the cash layout.
By the way, I know in this time of desperation, feeling on the bottom, nothing good is happening, all that. When I watch the Colts this year, there's two players I really like a lot. One is DeForest Buckner, who just every week does something to disrupt the offense. And the other is Alec Pierce. That is a really good player. And I'm not a big Michael Pittman guy, either downfield, or I really question his hands. But this Alec Pierce, long-term, he is a building block, and he might finally break the schneid of unimpactful receivers who they've drafted there, but yeah. I don't know. That occurred to me. I knew I'd be talking to you, and I said, man, Buckner and Pierce, those guys are players. That's why when you think of the Colts, you don't think that the cupboard is absolutely empty. They've got a few good guys on that team.
No, I love that you brought this up, because I talked to DeForest Buckner a lot, and he's one of the guys who right now I really feel for, because he's on a defense actually that is very productive right now. They're actually top 10 in a lot of the metrics. They've had multiple games this year where they haven't allowed a touchdown. I mean, they're playing really, really well. DeForest Buckner is the guy who an offense turns the tape on, before going into Sunday and says, oh my God, it's going to be a long day. He's relentless. He's relentless. He plays just about more snaps than any defensive tackle in the game. He's just a force. And Alec Pierce, I'm glad you mentioned him real quick. He is, I think, a guy, if they can ever get Jonathan Taylor going again, which obviously requires them to get their offensive line going. But if they ever get back to the play action game, that guy is going to eat very well, because he will go up and get it. And he is a very receptive pupil, by the way, right now, of Reggie Wayne, receivers coach, who's doing a great job.
Right. You know, I would just make this point about the Indianapolis Colts defense. If you think about it, okay, and you look at what happened in New England on Sunday, look at the Patriots' touchdown on Sunday, okay, came on a blocked punt, and it basically ended with a 2-yard drive for a touchdown. Okay. And look, I'm not saying that it's some utterly, absolutely preposterous thing here. But okay, so there's that. And then the other touchdown they score is on an interception return. So the Indianapolis Colts in Foxborough allowed 4 field goal drives and lost a game 26-3 that anybody who didn't watch the game wouldn't really understand. Well, let's really think about this. You held the New England Patriots to 203 yards. And that's what I say. Whenever you look at a team and you say, oh my God, all hope is lost. You know what? It's usually not lost. It's usually just misplaced. And right now, that hope with the Colts, if I'm Jeff Saturday, I say, oh my God, this is a debacle. This is this. And then you sit down and actually watch the game and you say, you know what? We are going to give the Las Vegas Raiders one hell of a football game on Sunday. That's just kind of what I think.
Yeah. No, and there's a basis for that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you got to score points, and that's why they are where they are. They haven't done it. There's no real mystery to that, right? But there's no question they have been a tough out just because of their defense. I mean, ask any of the quarterbacks they've played this year. Patrick Mahomes, Russell Wilson. Look, they allowed 17 points the previous week and lost to Washington, right? So, I mean, they have consistently been a tough out with a couple of exceptions because of their defense. It really just goes to show you how fundamental passing games, your quarterback and up front on the offensive line, they're so fundamental to success. You don't have that, and it kind of doesn't matter what else you have. That's where the Colts are, but they're not an easy out because of their defense. And by the way, the other guy I want to mention, or two guys, Stephon Gilmore has found the fountain of youth. That guy's playing well at 32 years old. New respect for that guy. And then Grover Stewart, one of the most fun nose tackles to watch in the entire NFL, because who watches nose tackles?
That's a great point. I'll end with this. They're the 5th rated defense that'll go into Vegas this week. And look, you think about, okay, what defenses out there are really, really great. And you look at some of the ones that have played very, very well so far. And I noticed this. I was looking yesterday at the stats. The Indianapolis Colts are allowing 20.3 points per game. The Tennessee Titans, who everybody think, and look, all praise to Mike Vrabel and that staff. They've done a great job. They're allowing 0.5 of a point less than the Indianapolis Colts. This is, I'm just telling you, I don't think this is going to be a debacle down the stretch. And I don't think it is because of the defense they play. Anyway, Stephen Holder, thanks so much for joining me. You're very educational. And thanks for telling and showing and letting my listeners hear exactly what the pulse is in Indianapolis. So thanks a lot.
You got it. Anytime, Peter.
Very interesting stuff from Stephen Holder, and we thank him for joining the podcast this week and trying to bring some sense to nonsense. Let's spend the second half of our podcast, Myles, talking about the other 31 teams, even though we're in a week where it feels like all 31 are going to get short shrift. because of what happened in Indianapolis. And I want to start with what we saw Monday night with the Baltimore Ravens. A couple of things that really were impressive about that game. The most impressive thing to me is that you lose your most important offensive player, Mark Andrews, who's out of the game with shoulder and knee injuries. He misses. So what does Lamar Jackson do? He says, hey, no problem. I've got Isaiah Likely. Now, America is just getting to know who this guy is, this wide receiver, tight end hybrid, 4th-round pick from Coastal Carolina. So Isaiah Likely comes through, first touchdown of the game in the impressive win at New Orleans. So there's that. And then they also lose Rashad Bateman, their most important wide receiver for the year. And so I was impressed with how Lamar Jackson made it pretty seamless and said, okay, we'll use Kenyon Drake. Until he goes out with a hammy, we'll use Deshaun Jackson, and we will figure a way. That was number one. But number two, how about this Justin Houston?
Yeah.
This guy is 94 years old. He's had 3 consecutive multi-sack games. And when Eric DeCosta, the general manager of the Ravens, signed him, he was almost embarrassed of what he could offer him. They had no cap money, no money left. And basically they paid him dirt cheap to come in. And he has been the most valuable person on that front seven for the Ravens. So, hey, look, Ravens 6-3, really impressive. Your thoughts?
Well, and you think about adding Roquan Smith also to that defense, and then how much better that can make them there. But I think the point you make about Isaiah Likely is great. I mean, those guys were talking him up a lot during the preseason, and he did have an impressive preseason, but it's still preseason football, right? But then he goes out there last week, has a touchdown against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and now you're seeing what he can really bring to that offense in Mark Andrews' stead. And so whenever Mark Andrews comes back, you then have both of those guys and they could potentially be out there at the same time. It makes things that much tougher for defenses. So I like where the Ravens are. I mean, I've thought basically going back to the preseason that the Ravens are good enough to win that division if they stay healthy. I mean, that was one of the things that just killed them last year was all of the injuries, including to Lamar Jackson. And they were still pretty competitive down the stretch with Tyler Huntley at quarterback still. So now that they have all those different guys back, obviously losing Bateman is a huge loss for the rest of the season. But if Lamar Jackson continues to play at a high level, they should win the AFC North. It's not a guarantee. I mean, Cincinnati's certainly going to have something to say about it. But I like where the Baltimore Ravens are at. And I think, yesterday going to what was a good win, you were able to make sure you're not giving up that lead in the fourth quarter. The Ravens seem like they're on pretty solid ground right now.
Josh Allen, the Bills quarterback, as we record this morning, is being evaluated, according to Chris Mortensen, for an injury to the ulnar collateral ligament in his elbow. And you saw it after he was sacked by Bryce Huff of the Jets, the strip sack. It was an awkward motion. And look at me trying to throw an invisible football right here on this podcast. But it was an awkward motion where in the middle of his motion, he got his arm grabbed and wrenched by Bryce Huff of the Jets. And you could see him after that. He was flexing his arm, trying to open and close his hand a few times. And clearly he was in some discomfort. And so now I will only make one point about how look, this would be awful for this team if they lost Josh Allen for any length of time. But I will say this. I do think Case Keenum, and look, cue the laugh track from everybody when I mention Case Keenum. I really like Case Keenum's ability to come in and potentially, if he has to play well. And I go back to his time in Minnesota with Stephon Diggs when he was really a force for good in that season with Minnesota. But we'll see. I think the Bills are just a little bit, even if Josh Allen does play and he's okay, I think it's going to be difficult for the Bills to sort of regain their stature atop the NFL after we've seen a few warts, particularly on that offensive line.
Yeah, and them not having a run game is still a significant factor. I mean, I don't laugh at you when you say what you said about Case Keenum. I mean, I was around him in 2015, 2016 with the Rams, and his demeanor that can have him go in there and just kind of settle things down, play with sometimes a little bit of reckless abandon, but as he's gained more experience, he knows what he's good at. And I think if he has to be in there as a short-term starter, right, maybe fill in for 2-3 games, the Bills are going to be okay. Now, he's already got that chemistry with Stephon Diggs. I mean, they were together in Minnesota. They created the Minneapolis Miracle together. That was one of the best things we've ever seen in the NFL in a playoff game, right? So I think that they'll be okay if Case Keenum has to come in for a game or 2 or 3. If it's any longer than that, it's obviously a disaster. Right. And the NFC, the AFC East has a lot of good teams. And right now, 3 of those teams have 6 wins. All right. In the Bills and the Dolphins and the Jets. And, the Patriots have 5. So it's not like the Bills are just going to run away with this thing in the AFC East. At least I don't think so at this point. But, if Josh Allen has to miss any time, that's going to be significant.
It is going to be significant. Mike McCarthy and the Dallas Cowboys go to Green Bay. It's the first Dallas Green Bay game in 3 years. Just going to go back in time a little bit. I went to Green Bay in Mike McCarthy, let's call it his gap year, 2019, when he was trying to rehab his image as a coach and get ready for his next job. And obviously, he did, and he rehabbed his image, and now the Cowboys appear to be on the right track. The one story I remember from that, I was in Mike McCarthy's pickup truck. We were going to dinner in Green Bay, and we passed Lambeau Field. And Mike McCarthy says, man, it still hits me right here. And he did not strike me in any way as a bitter man that he got fired, because it had been at that point, quite a while,
sure,
since he got fired. But what was interesting to me is what he said. He goes, because if you haven't been to Green Bay in the last 2 or 3 years, you don't really know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to try to describe it. The whole area around Lambeau Field, and Lambeau Field itself, looks like an incredibly modern, wonderful urban development. There's a great place called Titletown, right across the street from Lambeau Field, that has a fantastic brew pub, a beautiful hotel called Lodge Kohler, some great shopping area. And it just is really grown up and built so well around Lambeau Field. And Mike McCarthy told me, I went and I told my players, there's nothing but construction happening here over the last 6-7 years. And I told them, you guys are responsible for that. You guys have played so well and made this such a hot place. And you should be grateful, thankful, and understand that generations of Packer fans are going to look back at this time, at the time where they really rebuilt the stadium and the franchise. And it's all because of the success that you guys are a part of. And so I think he just feels like his 13 years there, the reason he's not bitter about it is that, he feels like he has really contributed, maybe not as much as Curly Lambeau, but he feels he's really contributed to this franchise an awful lot for a coach who got fired. And at the end, it was pretty ugly for him.
You can't write the story of the Green Bay Packers without Mike McCarthy. I mean, it just, when you win a Super Bowl, you etch your name into the history of a franchise. And, there is a Mike McCarthy way in Green Bay because he won a Super Bowl there. So, I mean, I think that's awesome that he feels so much gratitude for it. And frankly, the community should feel gratitude toward him too. I mean, it did not end well, but I mean, rarely does it ever end well for an NFL head coach.
Yeah.
And, so, I mean, it's interesting that it's been this long since Dallas and Green Bay have played one another, because it seemed like for years there, I mean, they were always playing each other, right? So this is certainly probably going to be an emotional trip for him in some way. And that's something that you've got to be able to set aside and then go out there and try to win a football game. But I think that they should do it. I mean, I don't think that there's any question right now that Dallas is a better football team going into this week than we would call the Green Bay Packers. So maybe the Green Bay Packers get right against their former head coach, but I don't know.
The New York Jets, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts from afar about the Jets. I'm sort of in the belly of the beast as I record this in my home in Brooklyn. And the Jets, Robert Saleh, when he showed up, he basically decided that the way to get this team most competitive the earliest is to build a great defense, which is what he knew so well. That defense, Myles, there's an old saying, defense travels. In other words, if you play a road game, you're still going to be really, really impressive on defense. That defense is good enough to play anybody in this league a really, really tough 4-quarter game. What do you think of the Jets?
Well, I like the way they play. I like the attitude that Robert Saleh has implemented. And it's funny, we think about a few weeks ago, which, I mean, it keeps getting longer away, where Saleh said he's keeping receipts. And it's like, okay, well, I guess you might have had a point, sir. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm a little sorry, because the way they play is really, really conducive to the team that they've built, right? And you talk about Zach Wilson and what he did against New England versus what he was able to do against Buffalo. Sometimes you've got to remember that as a quarterback, one of your first jobs is protecting the football. It's something that they were able to do against the Bills, and he didn't lose the game for them, because that's how good that defense is, right? You don't need your quarterback to do too much because they're that good. Right? They can produce takeaways for you. They can get you in a good position to be able to go down the field and score. So if you're Zach Wilson, that's an asset for you. Take the layups, as Chris Ballard once said about Carson Wentz. Now, don't try to do too much. And I know Zach Wilson talked about, I get frustrated when I get out of the pocket and then there's not a play and then I'm trying to do no, dude. Just make sure that you're taking care of the football, because that defense is going to be able to take care of you in turn.
The New York Jets have won 5 out of 6. And in those 6 games, the New York Jets basically have been, by any measure, one of the best defenses in football. And in those 6 games, they haven't allowed more than 22 points in any game. And look, they allowed 22 points to the Patriots, but basically Zach Wilson handed them about 21 and a half, in that game.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is a very interesting team to watch. And I think it's going to be fun. Let's, for a moment, look at the Minnesota Vikings. And speaking of, teams that are hot and teams that have played well in recent weeks, let's talk about the Vikings, who basically, since losing 24-7 in week 2 to the Philadelphia Eagles, have won 6 in a row. The only issue is all 6 wins have been 1-score games. And I don't think any of us truly know how good this team is. Their average margin of victory in those 6 games is 5.5 points. So do you think the Vikings are real, or are they a mirage?
I think they're real in part because I don't know how many real teams there are otherwise. I mean, most of them I think are, especially in that conference, right? Most of them are in the NFC East. The Eagles, Cowboys, believe in the Giants a little bit too, just based on the way that they've played under Daboll. But you look around the rest of the NFC and it's kind of like, okay, Seattle, yeah, I think they seem pretty real. San Francisco, you anticipate that once they get healthy, and they are, that they will play better, but especially in the NFC North. I mean, you know, Green Bay, my goodness, what's going on? Chicago, they're starting to find themselves a little bit. I mean, the way Justin Fields is playing, whenever you get 178 rushing yards, that's finding something. Detroit, come on. I mean, I'm sorry, Dan Campbell. I love you. I love Brett Holmes too, but you got to start winning more football games, right? So I think by default, the Minnesota Vikings seem like a good playoff team. Now, whether they will be the 2 seed or otherwise, I don't know yet. I mean, I think that they certainly have more things to prove, but as far as just being able to get wins, when you are able to win those close games, I think that means something, so
they're going to win that division by 6 games.
Yeah.
Just nobody else. And look, Chicago's going to finish in second place. They're a really, really interesting team right now. Okay, Myles. Are the Philadelphia Eagles at 8-0 the best team in football today?
Yes. And not just because of the record. I mean, we keep talking about most complete. I honestly, I think that that's actually true. I mean, they play a style that is conducive to their talent, right? And they know how to win in different ways. So I think because they can rush with 4, because Jalen Hurts is playing really, really well, because he can do it with his arm, also with his legs, and they've got A.J. Brown, they've got Devontae Smith, and they've got Miles Sanders, and they've got all these different guys. Their offensive line's playing really well, led by Jason Kelce. I feel good about them being the best team in football.
Yeah, I would agree with you right now. And the biggest reason is that, look, it's, what's crazy about the Eagles is that, they have now played 7 consecutive games without allowing more than 21 points. And they can beat you running easily as well as they can beat you throwing. Miles Sanders, 5.0 yards a carry, is a terrific back. As long as he stays healthy, they got a nice backup in Kenneth Gainwell. Hurts runs it well. Yep. This is a team that doesn't have a lot of holes. Myles, I want to end with just your thoughts on what we see in the Miami Dolphins and their receiving core, and particular Tyreek Hill, who, and again, you can say a lot of things about on pace and all that stuff, but Tyreek Hill right now, here we are at the season's midpoint. Okay. And after 9 games, he's got 1,104 yards receiving, and he's on pace, obviously, to surpass 2,000 yards. What are you seeing in Hill? Why do you think he's having a better year now than he had with Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City?
Some of it, I think, is scheme, and the way that Mike McDaniel's utilizing Tyreek Hill is a little bit different than what we saw in Kansas City. And, in Kansas City, it was Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, and there were sort of different elements to that. And you knew that those were the go-to guys, right? I mean, when there's 13 seconds left and the Chiefs have the football against the Buffalo Bills, it's going to Travis Kelce and or Tyreek Hill, and both of those guys get catches, and they send that thing into overtime and end up winning. But now it's a little bit different, in part because Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill kind of have similar skill sets, but not quite, right? And I think that Mike McDaniel has implemented an offense that is so much based on speed and so much based on the fact that they know that they can get Tyreek Hill the ball in pretty much any situation, and he's able to do something with it. Whether it's, going up in the air and making a contested catch, or catching it and running it as only he can with his speed. So I love that. I love that it's not just that, he's on pace to do what he's doing, right? But he's already had more yards through 9 games than any other player in NFL history. I mean, Isaac Bruce for the Rams in 1995 had 1,073. He's got 1,104 through 9 games. So, I mean, he's on pace for 2,085, which would break Calvin Johnson's single season record in 2012. But you know what? If he gets more than 122.75 yards per game, okay, that was the pace of Calvin Johnson back in 2012. So if he averages more than that, then he's going to not just break the record, but he's going to break the average that Calvin Johnson had. I think it's not just possible, but it could be likely. I mean, he is going out there every single week and just dominating defenses. And man, whether it's just scheme, talent, combination of the two, he's really putting together a magnificent season.
The amazing thing is he's on pace to surpass 2,000. Jalen Waddle is on pace to surpass 1,500. So it's really an incredible year, and good for Miami, good for Tua Tagovailoa, really proving that he deserves to be the long-term quarterback in Miami. Excuse me.
Indy on the
Myles,
brain.
thanks so much for joining me. We also thank our guest, Stephen Holder, for another edition of the Peter King podcast presented by Salesforce. We'll be back next week, and I'm on my way to Germany this week to see the first NFL regular season game there. So I'm going to inundate you with everything I've learned. So get ready for some German lessons next week. I'm sure I'll be fluent by the time we record the pod next week. For Myles Simmons, I'm Peter King, and this has been the Peter King Podcast presented by Salesforce.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.